Warning: the following video contains graphic footage. Viewer discretion is advised. What truly happened on November 22nd, 1963? And how were the Mafia involved? Welcome to This Conspiracist, and in today's episode, what really happened in Dallas in 1963. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald. A generally uneventful childhood with a few moves around the country for his father's work meant that JFK was relatively well travelled in his youth. He later attended Harvard University in Connecticut, studying government and international affairs, graduating, cum laude, with praise. Following graduation, Kennedy joined the US Naval Reserve, eventually commanding PT boats in the Second World War in a Pacific theater. During his military service, JFK gained multiple medals, including a Purple Heart, the medal given to those who were injured in combat. Following the end of World War II, Kennedy moved into journalism and eventually politics, where he became the representative for Massachusetts in Congress, representing the Democrats. He served a total of 6 years. After some successful stints in Congress, Kennedy planned a move into the Senate, winning by a small majority of 70,000 votes. Around this time, he and Jackie Bouvier married. In 1958, Kennedy retained his seat in the Senate by 874,608 votes, at the time the largest victory in the history of politics in Massachusetts. Following his successful re-election to the Senate, Kennedy started to prepare to run for the position of President of the United States. On January 2, 1960, JFK formally announced his run for the Democratic presidential nomination, with many supporters flocking to him due to his charm and charisma. After winning the party nomination, Kennedy faced the first of many trials. He needed to select a vice president to run with him. Many thought that Kennedy would choose the Labour leader and founder of the United Automobile Workers Union, Walter Reuther, seeing as he had previously joined his brother and Reuther in investigating the infiltration of criminal activity in the unions, as well as to gain support from the working class Americans. However, this was not meant to be. Kennedy selected Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democratic senator for Texas, as he believed it would gain him support in the South. This angered the trade and labor unions greatly. Despite the friction, Kennedy pressed on and appeared in the first ever televised debates in the US against the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. Nixon did not fare well in the debates, coming across as tense and nervous as opposed to Kennedy's charm. This led to Kennedy's landslide win in the election through the Electoral College, even though the popular vote was extremely close. On January 20th, 1961, JFK was sworn in as the youngest ever elected president and the 35th President of the United States. JFK's presidency came with many issues given that he was elected at the time of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet president at the time, was known for his abrasive attitude and during speeches often came across as attacking, which ired JFK. Not wanting to appear weak, he shot back, which led to increased tensions between the nations. After the USSR blocked the passage of East Berliners from travelling freely to the west by installing barbed wire fences, the tensions escalated further. Meanwhile, Cuba, a communist state under the control of Fidel Castro, had cozied up to the USSR. The previous administration under Dwight D. Eisenhower had drawn up plans to incite a revolt amongst the people of Cuba in order to get them to overthrow the current regime and allow the US to install a regime that fit better with their ideals. The plan was eventually signed off by JFK on April 4, 1961. Less than 2 weeks later, the US had begun what was soon to be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17th, 1,500 Cuban exiles, nicknamed Brigade 2506, trained by the CIA, landed on the Cuban shores. After Castro became aware of what was happening, many of these were captured and some executed. This led to Kennedy negotiating the release of 1,189 of these soldiers in exchange for $53 million worth of food and medicine for Cuba. This made Castro wary of the US government, fearing another invasion was imminent. In March 1962, the CIA proposed another plan to oust Castro from Cuba. Dubbed Operation Northwoods, this was a false flag operation designed to incite war with Cuba. Operation Northwoods will be explored in more detail in a later episode, but the premise was for the CIA to strategically commit terrorist acts against US civilians and military targets, blame it on Cubans, and incite the public to support a war with them. This plan was rejected by Kennedy in 1962, 20 months before his assassination. Soon after, the US spy plane noticed Soviet missiles being stocked and installed in Cuba. This action, which could be seen as a direct threat to the US, led to Kennedy enforcing a blockade around Cuba, not allowing any Soviet supplies to come into the waters of the Caribbean. This escalated tensions between the two superpowers to the point where the world was bracing itself for nuclear war. Eventually, both sides backed down and the missiles were removed from Cuba. Kennedy was known for many things outside of his dealings with the USSR. He was a staunch supporter of the civil rights movement, so much so that Mississippi and Alabama refused to vote for either candidate of the 1960 election because of their relaxed views on segregation, in addition to supporting black people to receive equal and fair treatment to white people throughout the states. This angered far-right and racist groups like the KKK. In addition to this, Kennedy was known to keep the company of women other than his wife Jackie. One such woman, Marilyn Monroe, arguably the most famous woman in the world at the time, even spent a weekend with him in 1962 at Bing Crosby's house. Marilyn Monroe died shortly before Kennedy in suspicious circumstances, but that will also be examined in a later episode. Unbeknownst to him, it is likely that Kennedy had made multiple enemies in his lifetime. From angering segregationists to his indecent affairs, there were many people who could have wanted Kennedy out of power. In November 1963, Kennedy was planning a trip to Dallas to smooth over disputes between conservatives and liberals in Texas, as well as to begin his 1964 re-election campaign. The full details of the route that the presidential motorcade would take were released a few days before the event was due to take place, in order to allow people to see the president. Kennedy was to travel from Dallas Love Field to Dealey Plaza, following a winding path of 10 miles in order to gain as much exposure to the crowds as possible. Kennedy was sat in the convertible Lincoln Continental limousine in order to be seen by his large crowds of supporters. At 12:30 p.m, the motorcade was turning onto Elm Street in order to join the freeway, when, as it passed the Texas School Book Depository, shots were fired. Many witnesses reported hearing 3 distinct gunshots. Governor Connolly, the Texan governor at the time, who was sat in the car with JFK, reported hearing the sound of a high-powered rifle, later identified as a Carcano M91 38 bolt-action rifle, and turned to see the president before being hit in the upper right back from a bullet that apparently made no sound. By this point, JFK had already been struck, with the bullet going through his neck. A second shot was fired, and then a third was heard, and at this point JFK had been struck in the head, with parts of skull, brain and blood covering the interior of the limousine. JFK was later pronounced dead from gunshot wounds to the head. There are multiple theories as to who was behind the assassination, but to start with, we shall examine the official story. Lee Harvey Oswald, an ex-Marine, was the sole shooter. He was an American Marxist who, after being discharged from the Marine Corps, defected to the USSR, where it is commonly believed that he became radicalized. The Warren Commission, the governmental inquiry into the assassination, determined that Oswald shot from the 6th floor window of a depository at the president. There are some unexplained holes in this story though. It seems awfully convenient that a Soviet sympathizer was the one to kill JFK, not long after the USSR and the US had started to smooth things over after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oswald was also known to be a poor shot, obtaining the lowest grade in a Marine Corps shooting exam, marksman. How could a notoriously poor shot hit such a small target in a moving vehicle? In addition to this, Oswald stated on many occasions that he was a patsy and that he was being set up for the murder.
I'm just a patsy.
Then there is the suspicious nature of Oswald's death. 2 days after the assassination of JFK, Oswald was shot to death by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner from Dallas with links to the trade unions. Ruby was also connected to the criminal underworld, including the Mafia, and was under surveillance by the FBI. He managed to walk into a police station and kill Oswald without anyone stopping him until after the deed was carried out. Oswald's death appeared to be that of a mob hit, which leads us to the second theory of JFK's assassination, the idea that the Mafia was involved. Labour unions and the Mafia were well connected in the 50s and 60s, and as stated earlier, Kennedy had angered a lot of labour unions due to his appointment of Johnson as vice president rather than Reuther. It is believed that this may have angered the Mafia, who could have used the vice president position as a way of continuing their illicit activities with less issues from law enforcement. While this is an acceptable theory, it begs the question, why wait that long to organise a hit on the president? The third theory centres around the United States government itself. This theory posits that the CIA and FBI had worked in tandem to assassinate the president due to a combination of his extramarital affairs, his support for labour unions, his support for the civil rights movement, and his unwillingness to incite war to remove Castro from Cuba in order to make it a puppet state of the US in the fight against the USSR in the Cold War. As previously mentioned, Operation Northwoods, the CIA false flag plan, had recently been shot down by Kennedy. The theory goes that after that, the intelligence agencies decided that it was appropriate to get rid of JFK as a way to gain sympathy and build resentment towards the USSR by using a communist sympathizer as a scapegoat. This theory also explores how the civil rights movement could have been quashed by removing the powerful figurehead that supports it, thus leading to the maintenance of the status quo. This theory has managed to gain traction for a variety of reasons. It is very easy to believe that the intelligence agencies only act for the good of themselves, as evidenced in the released files about GCHQ and the NSA by Edward Snowden. However, the two main driving factors behind the theory of agency involvement are the Zapruder film, the commonly seen video footage of the assassination of JFK, and the angles from which the bullets appear to have penetrated. The angling of the wounds, in combination with the way the president reacts in the Zapruder film, leads many to believe that the shots came from in front of the president. This conspiracy continues to fascinate many to this day, due to the many conflicting arguments presented. It is human nature to look for solutions to problems and to solve unfamiliar puzzles. But now is the time for review. Just how believable is this theory? I would rate this a 4 out of 5 on the believability scale, as there are many questions that have been left unanswered, and the conclusion that has been reached by the government just does not seem to ring true. I am a big believer in the theory that governmental agencies are involved, but don't believe everything you hear, including from me. Research this for yourselves. Thanks for joining me this week to examine one of the most famous assassinations of all time, and thank you for watching this episode of This Conspiracist: What Really Happened in Dallas in 1963. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this content. And as always, if you have any conspiracies that you would like to see examined, leave them in the comments down below. What else is being hidden from us? And remember, question everything.